Helping provide more insight into these trade talks is Dan McClory. He is the managing director and head of the China department for Boustead Securities. Dan, first I want to get your take on these talks back here in Washington. We saw a little bit of a rally on Wall Street at the end of Wednesday. What signs have you been watching for during last week's talks in Beijing and now back here in D.C.?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on the show, Elaine. And I think what everyone is looking for is some actual progress leading to a timetable when there will be a coming together of Mr. Xi and Mr. Trump, and they will actually work out the final details. As you could tell, in some of the weeks immediately prior, these events and meetings and potential dates were pushed out and pushed out. The tariffs stayed in place, weren't increased, but stayed in place. So I think what we're hearing and seeing now is that there's actual talk of what are the remaining sticking points, how do we get those boiled down and taken care of, and then how do we bring these two men together to resolve it. So that optimism that things are actually gelling and progressing and moving in a direction, I think is what has influenced markets, not just here in the U.S., but outside, and I think it's a positive signal.
And to your point, you know, you may not have seen it, but I noticed a lot of good body language today. Larry Kudlow describes, quote, good headway in Beijing last week. And there are other reports that claim this deal is 90% done. Why is the last 10% taking so long?
Well, as we heard from our man in Beijing, I mean, we're down to a couple of points here. One has to do with, in general, the concept of enforcement, which, you know, all the terms can get agreed on, but, you know, how do you make it stick? How do you give it teeth in both directions, by the way? So what's been proposed from the U.S. side is that there would be an immediate ability for the U.S. to enact tariffs that maybe would be taken away right now or had been suspended in the event of a lack of enforcement, but that China would agree to what they're calling a no retaliation clause. And that's really tough for the Chinese side to take. Effectively, they couldn't respond to the imposition of tariffs with tariffs of their own. So this is the ask from the U.S. side, and it's proving to be really challenging. And what we understand is the resolution of that could be, what kind of breaks this tie, is that the U.S. may give up on that no retaliation clause in exchange for an extended period of the current tariffs, so that Mr. Trump has something to go back to the U.S. citizens and the base with, but at the same time, China doesn't have to agree to the no retaliation.
Oh, I want to ask you more about that because we have seen recent concessions from the U.S. side involving auto tariffs recently, the classification of the opioid fentanyl. So you bring up that good point of U.S. concessions. Is that realistic that we could see something from the U.S. side?
Well, I think we should see perhaps more, and what is probably in the cards is also, you know, our structure in the U.S. with CFIUS, which examines, you know, foreign direct investment in the U.S. in critical sectors. That has been seen as being used on a retaliatory basis against the Chinese. And so I think there's some discussion going on about CFIUS and how that could maybe be, if not relaxed, at least normalized a little bit more so it doesn't give the impression that it's a political instrument. And I don't believe that it is, but I think it has that perception. So CFIUS and less restrictions on inbound investment from China to the U.S., perhaps in some of these critical sectors, that could be another piece that's currently on the table.
We've been seeing these talks go back and forth for weeks, long past this deadline that everyone thought would happen by now. Are people getting impatient? What's the business community thinking of all this? Are they just glad that both sides are at the table still?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I always say that in China, an agreement is a pause between negotiations, meaning there's always a lot of details. Even if you come to a meeting of the minds agreement and to a memorandum of understanding agreement, there's still so much to be worked out. But to your point, Elaine, yes, the business community wants to see this overdone, resolved, whether they're directly affected by it because they're being affected by tariffs themselves in their supply chain, or just because of what we call the overhang, the pessimism that is placed on trade, international transactions, because this is unresolved and we don't know what could occur. So I think for both reasons, the business community in general would like to see it being resolved. There is a very, very strong facet of the U.S. business community community, though, that wants to see some form of tariffs remain intact because they want to have some protection on their industries.
Dan McClory, always great to hear from you. Thank you so much.